I usually don't even use one of these. I like to walk around a little bit, but you got to stay semi-still, I guess, so the camera will pick it up. So I'll try to do that, even though everybody that might watch this would be better off if they just heard it and didn't have to see the person. As I said last night, it didn't take me long to realize, talking to different ones that I remember from all the years ago that I was here, it is amazing how many of you people had something you remembered negative about me. And I'm only going to scold you once. You should have told me years ago. Instead of carrying it all these years and finally saying, oh, I remember this. But I want to talk this evening with us for a few minutes. The abundant life should be exciting for every Christian. I've said this almost every period of study we've had this week. How many of you are happy you're here? Y'all getting better. Maybe if I stayed long enough, I could even get y'all to laugh a little bit. Christianity is fun. It ought to be. God's people are supposed to be happy. We should be excited about who we are. We've got the absolute best thing man can have. And we're going to talk a little bit about that tomorrow night as we sum up the lessons and we take a look at the rewards of the abundant life. How many of you like to be rewarded? You like things? You like presents? You like gifts? You like surprises? Some of you say it depends on who gives it. But we like gifts and good things that we receive. We're going to talk about that tomorrow night. And we need to remind ourselves and let God remind us of what we really receive through Jesus Christ. And it is truly beyond our ability to understand, appreciate, to grasp what God has done for us. Before I came to Fouke, I was preaching for a little congregation out in the country, out of Waldo. The congregation was known as Bethel. There were two church buildings. That was all that was in that little community. One was a building that belonged to the church, and the other was a denominational group right across the road. And the older man, who had been there for a long time, was quite a song leader. But he used to tell me, because I asked him one day, would you lead this song? And he said, no. I used to lead that song a lot. But the group across the road would always pay attention when we would sing it. How many of you know the song, Will There Be Any Stars in Your Crown? And he said, the other group would say, no, not one. No, not one. If we live this life and we don't put any stars in our crown, and this evening I want you to think about stars as souls. If there are no stars in our crown, shall I come and empty-handed, not one soul with which to greet him? Now I'm going to ask you this morning, or this evening, and I've got to throw this in real quick. We had a good meal a while ago, so some of y'all are going to get ready to go to sleep. So I'm going to tell you now, I won't call your name, because I learned better than that. The preacher was preaching one day, and Brother Jones went to sleep. And Brother Smith said, would you wake Brother Jones up? And the man looked at him and said, no, preacher, you put him to sleep, you wake him up. So, not going to get me in that trap. If you've ever preached and you believe the truth, then you've either preached or taught something along this line many times. God's business is saving souls. It's always bothered me that people would talk about a business meeting. And all we could talk about would be properties, buildings, money, and really didn't talk anything about souls. And I remember not too long ago, I was in a meeting and a man said, well, we finished the Lord's business now. Would y'all like to talk about Bible classes and worship? And I thought, you have lost your ever-loving mind. Do you think we miss it sometimes? What is the Lord's business? He sent Jesus into this world for souls. And he told us to go into all the world and bring men to the cross. So I want you to think, and if you're better tonight than you've been, see if you can raise your hand. And I heard so many excuses already tonight. My arm hurt. Somebody said I was cold and I didn't want to take the wrap off. Oh, we got excuses. So I'm going to ask you this. How many of you believe in the Great Commission? Well, y'all are getting better. Okay, watch out, because now I led you into this trap. When you say, yes, I believe in the Great Commission, I'm going to say that a little bit differently. How many of you believe that when Jesus said, the account we have in Mark, the one we have in Matthew, go into all the world, preach the gospel, make disciples of all men. How many of you believe that's the greatest commission ever given? There is no commission like it. Why? Because when Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, God, before the worlds were ever formed, Jesus Christ, he had placed Jesus to die on a cross because he loved us before we were ever formed. And he wanted to give us the opportunity to be free from sin, to start over again. You know, I talked about this from Matthew chapter 12, that setting where Jesus talked about, can a man go in and take the spoils of the strong man unless he first bind the strong man? Have you ever thought about this? Here's the picture I have for you tonight. Take the picture. Satan has a museum. And in this great museum, when you open the doors, it's kind of musty. And it smells like death. Because in that museum are the souls of every man, woman, boy, and girl who has ever lived or ever shall live. They all belong to him. Why? Because the grand God of heaven proclaimed, the soul that sinneth, it shall die. And when we sin, we become subjects to the master called the devil. But Jesus came, as God had promised way back in Genesis chapter 3, that though Satan would bruise his heel, Jesus would bruise his head. You get that picture? How many of you like snakes? Good. They are horrible. But here's the picture. The picture is, here's a snake. And a man goes to stomp the life out of the old snake. He kills the snake. But in the process, he bruises his heel. Well, this is a lesson for us to realize. How many of you have ever served Satan? Now watch out. You have, whether you wanted to, knew it. We all have, because we've all sinned. Now, did you ever realize just how dumb Satan is? Have you ever done anything and it didn't turn out the way you had it planned? And I don't mean for the better, I mean for the worse. Well, Satan had this elaborate plan. He wanted to have Jesus crucified. And he did. Dumbest thing he ever did. If he'd have had any sense, he would have left him alone. For it was only through having him crucified on a cross, buried in a tomb, and being resurrected again, that he could make it possible for those of us who are lost in sin to be free. So the picture is here in Matthew chapter 12. Jesus comes walking into the doors of this museum. And here we are. You ever look on, you could look as you walk down and you see the names under every soul. You could find yours and you could find mine because we're all there. But Jesus came saying, aren't you tired of this? Come unto me. All you that labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. Now, do we believe that? Do we believe that Jesus really died on the cross? Several years ago, more years than I care to remember, I was attending a school operated by members of the church somewhat north of here. And a man came to hold a meeting. And in that meeting, he made this statement. Jesus didn't really die on a cross. God told us that story because he wanted us to see how bad sin is. But the idea of being saved by blood, he said, is barbaric. And if you believe that you're saved by the blood of Christ, you are mistaken. I believe a lot of people today believe that, don't you? That Jesus didn't really die on the cross. How many of you believe he did? Well, as we start, make sure you get this in your mind today. This is a true story. A man about 87 years old, living out in West Texas. No wonder he was so old if he had to live in West Texas, right? But a man was riding with him out on his farm. The man was a Christian, and he said to him, he said, here you are, 87 years old. How long have you been a Christian? He said, 75 years. He said, well, tell me what the cross of Christ means to you. And suddenly, tears began to stream down the old man's cheeks. And he said, I believe that if every man, woman, boy, and girl who has ever lived or ever shall live were a saint and I alone a sinner, there would be a cross. You believe that? It's real nice to make salvation, well, he died for everybody. Did he die for you? Did he die for me? Do we sometimes think it was everybody else's sins that nailed him to a cross? Now here's the first point we've got to get. If we're going to change what's going on in the church today, and we're going to evangelize and bring people to Jesus, we've got to believe with all our heart that Jesus died for me. That he died for you. Yes, he died for all of us, but he would have died for me if I was the only sinner in the world. Now that's love, isn't it? How do you respond to people that love you? Well, sad to say, some people not very well. So here we are, going to all the world and preach the gospel. We're not going to spend a lot of time with this. I know that the Great Commission was given to the apostles and disciples of that day. The question is, does it apply to us today? And I'm going to tell you that I'm afraid many Christians today don't believe it does. You ask somebody, are you a Christian? Yes. Were you baptized in order to become a Christian? Yes. Do you believe you have to go to worship to be a Christian? Yes. Do you believe you have to take the Lord's Supper to be a Christian? Yes. You believe you have to give as you prosper? Yes, the Bible teaches that. So people say. But then you ask people, how many people have you brought to Jesus? Now wait a minute, preacher. You mean I got to know somebody? I just want to be a good person. Remember what we talked about last night? Every Christian should live so that someday somebody will say something like Ruth said to Naomi. What you got, I want. Where you go, I'm going to go. What you believe, I'll believe. Your God will be my God. Don't you try to get rid of me, because I want what you have. And that's the reason I've been telling you all week, smile. I know when you go to watch kids and grandkids play ball, you smile, you yell. I watched some of you in the building as we come in the last few worship periods. How many of you like babies? You like babies? How do grown people act when babies come around? Y'all know how you act, don't you? Plumb silly. Speak a foreign language, don't we? We just get all excited. We can even fight over who's going to hold it. But what about lost souls? Do we get that excited? It breaks my heart when I have heard people say, well, preacher, I went to visit that congregation over there and nobody spoke to me. If that's true, that's horrible, isn't it? Isn't that bad? If that can honestly be said of God's people, because we're dealing with the most precious thing of all. By now you should have already seen that I learned a long time ago that I believe one of the great ways to get people to see truth is to ask questions. If you're a Christian today, how did you learn the truth? How many of you believe that you just got up one morning and somehow through osmosis, you said, I need to be a Christian. I need to go obey the gospel. Any of you do that? I know every preacher here is saying, I hope not. Because none of us would need to be preaching, would we? How did you learn the gospel? As I've said before, and I'll say over again as long as I live. Somebody said to me the other day, well, preacher, you know, do you really understand how people who didn't grow up in the church really think and feel? I knew what they were asking. It was like, I don't think we have to be as faithful. Well, nobody's going to get me to say I'm sorry that my grandparents, my aunts and my uncles, my dad, my mother were Christians. In fact, that's the biggest blessing I have. That somebody taught me to love God, love His Word, respect the truth. Now, some of you remember my dad. You don't know him nearly as well as I do. I can tell you the other part of the story. It wasn't all roses, but I have said in amazement. My dad could quote the entire New Testament. Anybody in here do that? I think he could quote all the Old Testament. He said he couldn't, but every book he ever started, he finished. That took a lot of time, you know it. Took a lot of effort. Should preachers know the book? Yes. Should elders know the book? Yes. Do we sometimes? No, a lot of times people know current events. They know fairy tales, but I don't know if they know Jesus. You learn the truth somewhere. It may have been through grandparents. It may have been through your parents. It may have been bringing you to Bible class and worship. You had Bible class teachers and preachers who taught you, but you had to hear the message. And it had to convict you in your heart so that you could say, I want this. I want to be a Christian. Watch out. Here's the first thing that you got to think about when it comes to evangelism. Years ago, a couple came up to a church building. And another car pulled up beside them. The car got out and they ran over to their neighbors as they got out, and the lady said, "Oh, we are so glad you have finally accepted our invitation to come worship with us." And the lady looked at him and said, "We've been here for 3 weeks. Where have you been?" Evangelism. You think how we view Bible study and worship says anything to lost souls about how important this is? I hear people say, "Oh, I can't teach. I can't preach. I'm just not very important." And I hope I say this kind of. Y'all remember this old saying? If you can't help, at least get out of the way. Do we ever get in people's way? What did Jesus mean when he said, if we offend a little one, it would be better that a millstone were hung about our neck and we were cast into the depth of the sea? That's why these first few lessons were given tonight, the last few evenings, is so we could look at how important it is for the example we set, the life that we live before our fellow man. And that is a message that all the words in the world cannot outdo. In Ephesians chapter 3, Paul says in verse 10, by the church, the manifold wisdom of God is to be made known. Today, we have less missionaries, both on soil in America and foreign soil, than we have had in over 60 years. Why? One, because we don't have any missionaries. But two, because we don't have people to send them. Didn't the Great Commission say go into all the world? Well, where's your world? How many of y'all live somewhere around Fouke or Genoa or Texarkana? There's your world. How many souls you reckon are lost in our world? You remember Peter on the day of Pentecost? What a beautiful message. This same Jesus whom you've crucified, God hath raised him up and made him both Lord and Christ. Do you believe Jesus today is Lord and Christ? He's King of kings and Lord of lords. He is uniquely a king because he has always been one. And he's been crowned with glory. He is the anointed one. But there's something unique about our king. He's the only king I've ever heard of that died for his subjects. Many kings are willing to send people to die on their cause. But Jesus died for you and me on an old rugged cross. No wonder Paul said to Timothy and Titus, preach the word. Be instant in season, out of season, reprove, exhort with all long suffering and patience. The message needs to be spread today. And it starts with our lives. It starts with our attendance to worship, growing, learning more about God. I remember when I started school. First day I went home from school, and we were walking with several kids 3 or 4 of them were juniors and seniors. They had some books, and I kind of got around and looked at them. So when I got home, my mother said, "What's wrong with you?" And I said, "Mom, I'm not going back to school." She said, "Why, son?" "Well, Mama, some of those textbooks, I can't even read the word. Much less do I know what they're talking about. I can't understand this. So I'm going to quit school." You ever think sometimes today that we say, "Oh, there's so much to learn in the Bible. It's just better not to start." Peter said we should desire the sincere milk of the word that we can grow. And then the writer says in Hebrews chapter 5 that meat belongs to those who by reason of exercise have developed to be able to handle strong meat. Isn't it amazing? The more you know, brethren, the more you're going to want to know. When you ever catch it, you just can't turn it loose. So, a good many years ago, and I said this, and people look at me strange sometimes. We had moved to Idabel, Oklahoma when I was not quite 11 years old. And one of the deacons in that congregation had started preaching out in a little country congregation. And so he said to me one Wednesday night, he said, "Sunday, you're going to go with me and you're going to preach that Sunday." I was scared to death. But I made it. Not sure what I said. But when we headed back, he said, "Okay, you got that over with. You're going to preach every Sunday now." And I've been preaching ever since, except for a period of time when I got so discouraged with life, the church, the problems that we create, self-induced and other influences, that I quit preaching. And I thought, there's got to be a better way. I even went so far as to say I would never encourage another man to be a preacher again. You know what stupid is? Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw him. When you really look at what God has done for us, that was the most miserable time that I have ever lived. Someday, many of my brethren are going to look back and say, "Why did I miss it? Why did I take the Lord's business and the saving of souls so lightly that I allowed people who needed so much to find Jesus to leave them untaught?" I won't call a name. Some of you remember this. I was preaching here. The month was in January, and it was cold. If I called his name, y'all would know, most of you would say, "Oh yes, I remember." If I remember correctly, he was 84 years old. And one Sunday night, he came to be baptized right here. And so we went back and got ready. And when I stuck my foot in that water, none of us knew the heater was out. And that water was ice cold. And I jumped back and I said, "You don't want to get in here. Maybe we can call somebody in Texarkana or somewhere and we can go." He said, "Oh no." He said, and I'll never forget these words. He said, "I've waited too long already." So we baptized him. He crawled up on the top steps and sat down and began to cry like a baby. I thought maybe he'd had a heart attack. He was so cold. I said, "What's wrong with you?" I can hear him now. He finally said, "My mother and dad were Christians. My wife was a Christian. She raised all our kids to be Christians. And I have known the gospel since I was 13 years old. And now all of them are gone. My life is spent. And now I come and throw the ashes of an ill-spent life in the face of the Lord and say, forgive me. And then he said, he will. But oh, the regrets that I have. Wow. We don't want to be like that. We don't want to do less than our best. Because he loved us with everything he had. Now, here's some practical ways to evangelize. I moved to a town in East Texas years ago, and one of the elders and his wife said to me, we want to evangelize. He owned the bank. She was a school teacher. And they said, if we will get somebody to come and study the Bible in our home, will you teach the class? I said, how many ever you set up? It took us about 6 weeks in each Bible study for 10 years. We had 7 studies a year. They all lasted 6 weeks, so that was 42 weeks out of the year. In 10 years, those people had 218 people sit in their house. And of that number, 188 were baptized into Christ. She cooked a good meal every night that we were there. She was a gracious host. And I had the ball of my life. Wouldn't you? I got to tell you this. She called me and said, I've got somebody we're going to study with. Said her name is Penny. She's a school teacher, new, and she's agreed to study with us. She wants to get married. Her husband is a Christian and she's not. But he told her he wouldn't marry her if she hadn't had a Bible study. So we began to study. 3 weeks in, she asked me a question and I said, let's see what the Bible says. And suddenly she picked up a fork and threw it at me. I was younger then, I ducked. The next week she threw a knife. And I remember saying to the lady, I said, don't set the table anymore till we get through. I want to get through this Bible study. She got so angry that she stormed out. We didn't know if she would be back. The next night she came back and she said, okay, preacher, listen to me. I am sick and tired of every time I ask you a question, you say, let's see what the Bible said. You tell me what you think. I said, no, doesn't make any difference what I think. She married that young man. Today her name is Penny Nichols. I hear from her once a year on her birthday that it took. That's been 47 years ago. If you've ever experienced that, you will never cease to be evangelistic in your life. Winning a golf tournament, playing ball, having a grandkid, all of them may be wonderful, but they don't compare with seeing someone come to Jesus Christ. Somebody told you the story of Christ. Every one of us can visit, write cards, send emails, offer prayers, letters. You remember David when he and his men were fighting a war and they were tired and they stopped. They still had some of the enemy fleeing that they were going after. And some of the older men were so tired they just couldn't go any further. So David said, here's what you're going to do. While we go and finish this, you stay here with the stuff. And the younger men said, okay, they can do that, but they're not going to get into the spoils. Remember what David said? Oh yeah, they will. It will all be the same. Years ago, a son called her daddy, or her mother, his mother, and said, "Mother, tomorrow, next Sunday is Mother's Day. My brother and 2 sisters are coming to see you Sunday. We want you to be ready." So they all got to the house, and Mama wasn't there. And in a little bit, she came in. And they said, "Mama, where have you been? We called you. We made an appointment with you." And Mother looked at him and said, "Somebody very important called me a long time ago." Do we really believe that when we come to worship and people see us in worship constantly, that they see that there's a difference in us? That Jesus called us here. He called us for a purpose. Every one of us is a part of the Great Commission in what we do. I read an ad recently looking for a preacher. Never read this one before. I don't know if any of you other preachers have read this before. I can't remember it exactly, but here's what it said. It said, older congregation made up of old people with little to no hope of growth, looking for some preacher to come minister to us in our old age. How many of you would have signed up for that job? I happen to know the man who sent out the ad, so I sent him one back. I sent him a note back. And I said, how does that relate to what Jesus said? You remember what Jesus said? Let the dead bury the dead. We need to be up saving souls. And I'm afraid we have forgotten that it's not rocket science. The truth hasn't changed. God is still the same. Jesus is still the same. He still shed his blood for every soul that has ever been or ever shall be. And I'm going to tell you, a lot of people today are looking for truth. They're tired of fear. They're tired of empty promises. They're tired of worry and frustration. They need the truth. But we need to be sure that we've anchored our soul. Now, you may have thought that I was going to tell you a lot of things tonight. When you go home tonight, think it over. And if I had done even a fifth of what I intended to do, then I hope you'll get home and say, well, you really did have something to say. Years ago, a man went out into one of our reservations. He was preaching. And one Sunday, an Indian man came forward. And he said to the preacher, what would it cost me to be a Christian? He said, look what I have brought to the Lord. And he laid down a pile of hides that he had caught. That was his livelihood. And the preacher said, no, that's not what the Lord wants. But with a sad look, the old man walked back, came back into the building, and laid his traps on top of the hides. And he said, old Indian, give traps too. Would you give a job if you thought that's what the Lord wanted? But the preacher said, no, that's not what he wants. So now the old man has tears in his eyes, and he walks back into the crowd, and he takes hold of a lady's hand, and she has a papoose on the back. And he brings them down, and he stands them beside the hides and the traps, and he said, old Indian, give these too. And the preacher said, it nearly broke my heart when I said, That's not what God wants. And he said the old Indian cried with a broken heart and finally said, well, old Indian, give Indian too. Evangelism really can be summed up in that concept. When I have given my heart, my soul, my all to the Lord, number one, I don't see race anymore. I don't see old or young, rich or poor. I don't see tattoos. I don't even see all these young kids with all this colored hair. It's souls. Jesus didn't die for you to be a male or a female, to be rich or poor, lovely or ugly. He died so we could all be glorious and redeemed in the blood of the Lamb. Have you been redeemed? I mean, have you truly, with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, said, he is mine and I am his? You can have everything else, but I can't part with the Master. Until we do that, the church is going to suffer. Our families will suffer. Society will suffer. But when you and I make up our mind, and we can truly say, y'all remember this old song? The first stanza says, none of self and all of thee. Remember what the last stanza says? None of self and all of thee. Old Indian, give Indian too. Have you given everything you have to the one who loved you, who gave everything he had? He gave his life's blood that you and I could be redeemed. Let's stand together and sing.